Wingrave was very fortunate in the 1960s to be one of the few villages in Buckinghamshire to have a report made by Sir Hugh Casson, Condren Partners, setting forth how the village might develop in the succeeding 20 or 30 years. And this has now largely happened. So we have a very comfortable blend of new and old. There are the conservation areas around the church and going down to Nup End, containing many fine old buildings, and then there has been some good infill development as well as the new estates, which have brought new blood into the village, which is a good thing for any village. Well, we came to Wingrave in 1971 and were immediately struck by the friendliness of the village. Friendliness of the older residents, Hilda, the old postmistress, and Vic Rickard, the church warden then, and there being a very comfortable mix of long-standing residents and newcomers. It was neither a commuter village, nor was it, as some other villages, a very reserved estate village. It had a very comfortable and a very active village always. We were only here 2 years, I think, when there was a grand pageant organised by the late John Camp, and from that day onwards, really, every few years there have been events in the village that have brought villagers together. Those who perhaps work outside and less seen in the village then get to know people who are here the whole time. A very sociable village, with the community centre having been developed from the earlier temperance hall. Of Wingrave Church, it is known there was a church in the Domesday survey, but nothing of that remains. The earliest parts now being the font and the parts of the chancel from the early 13th century. The main body of the church was then developed with the arcades in the 14th century, the larger windows being added, as is often the case, in the 15th century. But then, with many churches in the 17th, 18th centuries falling into disrepair, and there was a great revival in the 1888 when the church was fairly comprehensively restored, except for the tower, which was rebuilt, the top part of it, in 1900. There are many quite interesting memorials in the church, one of them being to the Reverend Richard Woolley, who was the minister who invoked the last ducking or weighing of a witch in the village. He died in 1792, so this was only just over 200 years ago. Bell ringing in Wingrave has a very long history. Bell ringing, as we know it in England, started in the late 16th, early 17th century, and at that time there were in Buckinghamshire just 2 rings of 6 bells. One was at High Wycombe, and the other one was here in Wingrave. And we had 6 bells right until 3 years ago, as many of you will know. 100 years ago, the church had been restored in 1888. The tower was not done then. It was heightened, and a new bell frame was installed for 8 bells in 1900. But interest or funds ran out, and only 6 bells remained. And until for the millennium, it was thought a very good idea, bell ringing having flourished in recent years in Wingrave, that we should make a great effort and have 2 new bells cast to make an octave, so that increases the amount of ringing by something like 50 times more opportunity for bell ringing in terms of the complexity of ringing and the interest. And these were installed with the help of a Millennium Commission grant in 1997. And so for the last 3 years we have, as many of you will know, been ringing 8 bells. Now, bell ringing is a peculiarly English art. Very little of it done elsewhere except in English-speaking countries. And it is a mathematical form of ringing whereby the bells change places with each other each time they ring. It's a bit like knitting, if you can imagine 8 strands of wool, and these strands, every time the bells are rung, change places and make a pattern. And as in knitting, you can have different patterns or tunes or methods of ringing, as we call it. When we are ringing, you may notice that we always start in what is called rounds, that is down the scale from the smallest or highest note to the largest, and we will then ring our changes, names, some old names such as Grandsire and Hereward, more modern names, Yorkshire Surprise, Cambridge Surprise, Ariel. There's a great advance in recent years in ringing on anything up to 12, and in case of Birmingham, 16 bells. But on our 8 bells, we are gradually advancing through different methods or tunes. There is by canon law required to be at least 1 bell in every church to call people to worship. Whereas many churches still have 1 bell from the again, 15th, 16th centuries onwards, more and more bells became to be installed in churches to make a greater noise, if you like, to call people to church. But it has been known as an art and science and also an exercise. The physical exercise is not that terribly great, but it is obviously an exercise, and people, ringers, we take enjoyment not only in calling people to church, but in developing our art of ringing, trying to ring more precisely, trying to ring more tuneful methods. Before one can be a competent ringer, of course, like in swimming, you need to have basic exercises, and this can take 2 or 3 months. After 2 or 3 months, one ought to be able to ring in with others, and then it depends how much time you have to devote to your hobby as to how fast you proceed. We have practices once a week. There are attractions for young people from the age of about 8 or 9 upwards, right through to 70 or 80-year-olds have learned to ring for the first time. Well, at first glance, you might think Windmill House was built in the 19th century, because that is the date, or about 1900, of the windows at the front. However, it was built in the middle of the 18th century. We have a date of 1742, and almost continuously a record of owners and tenants since that date. Just 2 up and 2 down, quite a small house then, but prominent in the centre of the village. Behind it was a little lane known as Goose Pasture Lane, which has now been blocked up. However, in 1819, it was doubled in size and then further extended, as we have dates on the roof of the leadwork, 1827 and 1832. Now, in the 19th century, we have a record that there was a baker lived there, and there are signs that there may well have been a little shop. And I think this is where the attachment from the bakery and Windmill Hill Farm came. It is known that one of the tenants was, in Rothschild days, overseer to Windmill Hill Farm. And I think this is where the windmill context arises. The deeds of the Rothschild ownership are very well bound in vellum, and we're very fortunate to have these. The house has 1 or 2 mysteries. We met owners from the 1930s some years ago. They said, "I suppose you find the cellars useful." Well, now, to this day, we have not found these wonderful dry cellars that were mentioned in a sale notice in the 19th century. So that is a mystery we still have to find one day. No experience of haunting in the house. From the day we first saw it, it always struck us as a very happy house. Easygoing stairs, people who visit usually feel it a comfortable and happy house, even if they get lost in its somewhat rambling passages. Steam in the village. Well, Jubilee as a traction engine I have now owned since 1977, which of course was a Jubilee of Queen, and the reason for the name. Previous to that it didn't have a name. I am something like the fourth generation of steam traction owners, my father, grandfather and great-grandfather also having worked in steam. The engine was built in 1908 and went straight down onto an estate at Speldhurst, whose contact we have remade this year, and have obtained an old photograph taken about 1913 of the engine in its home territory down in Kent. Here in Wingrave it has been very active over the years. We go to 4 or 5 rallies a year, down to Pitstone Farm Museum, and operate such machinery as thrashing drums, it having spent its working life, incidentally, operating wood sawing machinery and hauling trees on the timber estate down in Kent. Well, earlier this year we reenacted a little scene that was very common in the 19th century, where engines such as these would tow thrashing machinery from farm to farm through the winter and thrash the farmer's corn, move on from one farm to the other. And in this sequence, very often it is necessary to pull machinery by rope through narrow gateways, and this is what we reenacted earlier this year. In various parades in the village, Jubilee has taken part and led the parade this year through the village onto the recreation ground.